Iceland is a place that seems almost impossible, a land forged by fire yet surrounded by icy seas, where volcanoes rise beside vast glaciers in a breathtaking balance of extremes. For thousands of years, its distant shores, covered in black volcanic sand, remained untouched by humans. But when settlers arrived in the 9th century, they built something extraordinary, a community without kings, a republic in a world ruled by monarchs, and a literary culture that would one day outshine those of far wealthier European realms. This is a story about how people transformed one of the most inhospitable corners of the planet into a home. It's a tale of Vikings fleeing from tyranny, of Irish monks seeking solitude with God, and of a society that invented democracy when the rest of Europe still lived under feudalism. About 20 million years ago, something incredible began happening on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Two giant tectonic plates, the North American and Eurasian, started pulling apart. From this wound, molten magma erupted upward from the planet's depths. The process continued for millions of years, throwing more and more lava onto the ocean floor. Approximately 16 to 18 million years ago, the peaks of underwater volcanoes finally broke through the ocean's surface. A new island was being born. Volcanoes exploded with incredible force, hurling columns of ash and steam into the sky. Lava flowed in rivers, freezing in the cold air and creating fantastic shapes. Over millions of years, the island grew, changed, was destroyed and born again. About 2.5 million years ago, the Ice Age began. Enormous ice caps covered most of the island, up to a kilometre thick. But beneath this ice, volcanoes continued to erupt, creating subglacial eruptions. When a volcano exploded under a glacier, gigantic masses of water were suddenly released, creating catastrophic floods that changed the landscape in hours. These cycles of freezing and eruption repeated dozens of times. The last ice age ended approximately 10,000 years ago. When the ice retreated, it left behind a land covered in volcanic ash, with deep fjords carved by glaciers into the coastline, with enormous glaciers still lying on the highest plateaus, and with active volcanoes reminding everyone that the island is still alive and growing. Even today, Iceland remains one of the most volcanically active places on the planet. Major eruptions occur on average every 4 to 5 years. To understand why Norwegian Vikings began colonizing Iceland, we must understand what was happening in Scandinavia in the 9th century. For centuries, Scandinavia consisted of countless small chiefdoms that constantly warred with each other. But in the 870s, one man decided to change this forever. His name was Harald Fairhair, and he had an ambitious goal, and to unite all of Norway under his rule. He fought for years, battle after battle, fjord after fjord, gradually subduing or destroying those who stood in his way. The culmination came at the Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872 CE. A coalition of Norwegian chieftains who refused to submit to Harald gathered a huge fleet to settle the matter once and for all. The battle was fierce and lasted all day, but Harald won. After this, resistance was broken. Norway became a united kingdom. But what happened to the defeated? Some submitted and swore loyalty to Harald. Others were killed. But many, especially proud aristocrats who could not accept subjugation, decided to flee. They did not want to live under the rule of a man they considered a tyrant. They had ships, crews, families, and they knew about islands to the west. The Orkneys, Shetlands, Faroes, which were already partially colonized by Norwegians. But these places were crowded. A new land was needed. That's when they heard about a large island even farther west, perhaps from Irish slaves, perhaps from travelling merchants. An island of fire and ice where no one ruled, where one could start a new life, free from kings and their taxes. It sounded like a promise, and they sailed. The first Norwegian colonist whose name we know was called Ingolfur Arnason. According to the Icelandic sagas, he was a Norwegian aristocrat who got into conflict with other chieftains and decided it was better to leave Norway before it was too late. Around 874 CE, he loaded his ships, family, slaves, livestock, tools, grain, and set off westward. The journey was hard. The distance from Norway to Iceland is about 1,000 kilometres of open ocean. The Vikings were excellent sailors, but their ships were open, without cabins, and the North Atlantic is famous for its storms. People, livestock, all the cargo, everything was battered by waves, soaked by rain and spray. The journey could take a week or more, depending on the wind. When Ingolfur finally saw the shore of Iceland, he did something strange. According to tradition, he threw overboard the wooden pillars of his high seat, sacred objects for every chieftain, and promised to settle wherever the gods washed them ashore. This seems odd to us today, but for the Vikings it made perfect sense. They believed the gods controlled fate, and if the gods chose the place, it would be the right place. The pillars washed up in a wide bay on the southwest of the island. Ingolfur named this place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, because of the steam rising from geothermal springs. Today it's the capital of Iceland, but then it was just a place where smoke rose from the ground in the middle of an empty wilderness. Together with Ingolfur came his sworn brother, Hjörleifr Hrodmason. But unlike Ingolfur, who was a pagan and trusted in the gods, Hjörleifr was a Christian, or at least had Christian slaves, and this religious difference led to tragedy. The sagas tell us that Hjörleifr's slaves killed their master and then fled to islands off the western coast. When Ingolfur learned of this, he tracked down the killers and killed them all. These islands are still called Vestmannaeyjar, Islands of the Western Men, meaning Irishmen. What happened to the Irish monks? The sagas claim that when the Norwegians arrived, the monks fled, leaving behind books, bells, and staffs. They did not want to live alongside pagans, especially warriors. Perhaps they returned to Ireland, or perhaps they sailed even farther west seeking new solitude. No one knows their fate. But their time in Iceland was over. Now this was Viking land. After Ingolfur, a wave of emigration began. Over the next 60 years, approximately from 870 to 930, thousands of people left Norway and other Scandinavian countries and migrated to Iceland. This period is called the Age of Settlement. Why did they come? The reasons varied. Some, like Ingolfur, fled from political conflicts. Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway created many losers who did not want to live under the new order. Others sought a better life. Norway was overpopulated, land was expensive, and there wasn't enough for everyone. Iceland promised unlimited spaces where everyone could take as much land as they could work. There were also those who simply loved adventure. We know surprisingly much about these settlers thanks to a unique book called Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements. This text, written in the 12th century but based on older oral traditions, contains the names and stories of about 400 principal settlers. This is an unprecedented document. No other European country has anything like it. Most colonists were Norwegians, but there were also Danes, Swedes, and people from already colonized islands. Many brought with them Irish and Scottish slaves, especially women. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders confirm this. Approximately 75% of male ancestors were Scandinavian, but about 60% of female ancestors were from the British Isles. Among the settlers were not only men. One of the most famous was Uda the Deep-Minded, a widow who fled from Scotland after her son's death and founded a powerful dynasty in Iceland. She distributed land to her people, freed her slaves, and gave them land to work. When she died, she was buried in a ship on the seashore, an honour usually reserved for great warriors. Settlers established a simple rule for dividing land. Everyone who arrived first could take as much land as they could walk around in one day, carrying a torch. For women the rule was the same, but instead of walking they could ride around the territory leading a young cow. Those who arrived earlier got the best land and coastal areas with mild climate, good fishing grounds and natural harbours. By 930 it became clear that some form of central organisation was needed. Conflicts were inevitable, and there needed to be a way to resolve them. That's when the Icelanders created something revolutionary, the Althing. In 930 CE, something extraordinary happened in Iceland, something so revolutionary that its true significance is hard to overstate. At a time when all of Europe lived under the rule of kings, emperors and feudal lords, when power passed through conquest and inheritance, when common people had no voice in their fate, the Icelanders created a parliament, not a royal council, not an assembly of aristocrats, but a true general assembly of all free people of the island. They called it the Althing, the General Assembly. This was not just a political body. It was the heart of the nation, the place where laws were made, disputes were settled, marriages were arranged, stories were told, and where the country's fate was determined not by one king's sword, but by the consensus of many. Summer of 930. From all corners of Iceland, people set out on a journey. Some walked for days, leading horses loaded with tents and supplies. Others rode in small groups. They all headed to one place, a wide plain between two tectonic plates where the Earth's crust was splitting apart, creating a dramatic rift in the landscape. This place was called Thingvellir, Plains of Assembly. Why here? Geography mattered. Thingvellir was roughly central to Iceland's settled areas, equidistant from most major communities. There was fresh water. The Öxar River flowed through the plain. There were flat areas for tents, but most importantly, there was a natural amphitheatre, a high basalt wall they called Lögberg, the Law Rock. From this spot, standing on the rock, a speaker could be heard by thousands gathered below. Who decided to create the Althing? The sagas credit one man, Grimur Goathead, a chieftain from the Borgarfjörður region. But in reality, it was likely a joint initiative of the island's leading godar, who realised some form of common governance was needed. They sent Grimur to study Norwegian regional assemblies. Grimur spent 3 years travelling Norway, studying different systems, then returned with a plan. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Once a year, in midsummer when days were longest and weather best, all free men of Iceland could gather at Thingvellir for 2 weeks. There together, they would decide matters concerning the entire island. This was not representative parliament, this was direct assembly. Everyone could come, everyone could speak, everyone could vote. The first Althing in 930 was probably small by later standards, perhaps a few hundred men. But the symbolic significance was enormous. For the first time, Icelanders acted as a single nation. They created common laws, based on old Norwegian legal traditions but adapted to Icelandic conditions. Most importantly, they elected a law speaker, a person who had to memorise all the laws and recite them at the Althing over 3 years, 1/3 each year. Why a law speaker? Because laws were not yet written down. Icelanders could write. They knew runes. But writing was used rarely, mainly for magical or memorial inscriptions on stone or wood. Laws were transmitted orally, as was most knowledge in Viking society. The law speaker was a living book, a human library. The first law speaker was Ulf Ljótur, the same man who helped Grimur develop the legislative system. Over 3 years, he had to recite all of Iceland's laws from the Law Rock so everyone could hear and know them. This required phenomenal memory. But for Vikings who memorized complex genealogies, long poems and sagas, this was entirely possible. The law speaker position was elected. After 3 years, the assembly could re-elect him, or choose someone new. This was not an inherited position, and it gave no real political power in the usual sense. The law speaker could not issue orders, command armies, or collect taxes. His power was moral and intellectual. He knew the laws better than anyone, and his interpretation carried weight. But decisions were made collectively. One of the Althing's main functions was administering justice. But Icelandic justice worked completely differently from modern systems. There was no police, no prosecutors, no prisons. When someone committed a crime, murder, theft, insult to honour. The victim or their family had to bring the case themselves. If you killed someone, the victim's family could either demand vergild, monetary compensation, or declare blood feud. But first the case had to be brought to the Althing. A panel of neighbours assembled, a kind of jury. They heard both sides, examined evidence, called witnesses. Then they delivered a verdict. If found guilty of murder, you could be declared skogarmadur, an outlaw. This was the most terrible sentence. Being an outlaw meant you lost all rights. Anyone could kill you without consequences. You could not ask for help, could not stay in any house more than 3 nights. You were expelled from society like a wolf, hence the name. Some outlaws tried surviving in the mountains, hiding in caves, hunting sheep. Others tried fleeing abroad. Many simply died from hunger or cold. But the system was not cruel for cruelty's sake. It was pragmatic. In a society without prisons, without professional law enforcement, social exile was effective punishment. The possibility of paying vergild instead of vengeance allowed avoiding endless cycles of violence. If the victim's family accepted money, the case was closed. Honour was satisfied and peace restored. Of course, the system didn't always work perfectly. The rich and powerful often could avoid punishment. But the principle was established. Law was higher than personal force. Beyond the drama of the Althing, life for most Icelanders revolved around survival. The typical Icelandic farmer worked from dawn to dusk. In summer there was hay to cut, critical for feeding livestock through winter. Buildings needed repair. Turf had to be collected for fuel, since trees were scarce. Bird eggs had to be gathered from cliffs, a dangerous job where men descended on ropes. In autumn came the rett, the sheep roundup. Sheep grazed freely in the mountains all summer, often mixing with sheep from other farms. In autumn, all the farmers of a district gathered together and went into the mountains to drive the sheep down. This was hard work lasting days, but it was also a social event. People saw neighbours they might not have seen for months. After the rett came the slaughter. Most sheep were killed before winter, since feeding large flocks through the cold months was impossible. The meat was preserved in every way possible: salted, smoked, dried, fermented. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides became clothing and shoes, intestines became strings and thread. Winter was a time of relative rest, but not idleness. Women spun wool and wove cloth. Icelandic wool was high quality and one of the few things Iceland could export. Men repaired tools, made new ones, braided rope, and everyone, men, women, children, gathered around the fire during long winter evenings to listen to stories. Sagas about heroes, gods, distant lands, and great battles. 10th century Icelanders were pagans. They believed in a pantheon of gods headed by Odin, god of wisdom, war, and poetry. There was Thor, god of thunder, protector of mankind, who fought giants with his mighty hammer Mjolnir. There was Freyja, god of fertility and prosperity. There was Freyja, goddess of love and magic. But Norse paganism was not an organised religion in the modern sense. There was no church, no dogmas, no sacred texts. Faith was both personal and communal. Each farmer had favourite gods to whom he appealed for help. Sometimes these were simple prayers, sometimes sacrifices, usually animals. The godar also served as priests. They conducted blot, communal sacrifices and feasts, usually 3 times yearly, at winter's start, midwinter, and summer's start. These were important social events where the community gathered, ate sacrificial animals' meat, drank ale or mead, and renewed social bonds. Vikings also believed in fate. The Norns, 3 female deities, spun the threads of each person's destiny. What was written on that thread could not be avoided. This led to a certain fatalism, but not to passivity. Since you cannot avoid your fate, the best you can do is meet it bravely and leave behind good fame. Fame was the most precious possession. Gold can be lost, life ends, but if your name lives in sagas, you achieved immortality. But in Europe, a new force was rising: Christianity. By the 10th century, most of Western Europe was already Christianized. Norway too was gradually accepting the new faith, though often by force. Norwegian King Olaf Tryggvason was a fanatical Christian who forcibly converted Norway. He tortured and killed those who refused baptism. He destroyed pagan temples, burned sacred groves, and now he turned his attention to Iceland. Olaf captured Icelanders arriving in Norway, holding them hostage and demanding Iceland accept Christianity. He sent missionaries with orders to convert people. One missionary, Thangbranda, was a warrior priest unafraid to use his sword. The sagas tell he killed several men who challenged him or mocked his sermons. The first Christians began appearing in Iceland in the late 10th century. At first there were few and they were tolerated. But the situation became complicated when Christians began publicly criticizing paganism. They called the old gods demons, blot horrible sacrifices, and pagans damned to hell. Conflicts arose. Some Christians refused to participate in blot. Some pagans attacked Christians, destroyed their crosses. By 999, Iceland was on the verge of civil war. Christians and pagans gathered in hostile camps. Each side had warriors, weapons, and both were ready to fight. Summer of 1000. Thingvellir was more crowded than ever. Christians gathered on one side of the plain, pagans on the other. Both groups were armed. The air was electric with tension. The Christian faction declared they no longer recognized the old laws and would create their own. This was essentially a threat to split the nation. The pagan majority responded they would not allow this, even if force was necessary. Then the law speaker, a man named Thorgeir Ljósvetningagudi, made an unexpected move. Thorgeir was a pagan, a godi, and a respected man trusted by both sides. He asked for a day and night to think. He returned to his tent, lay down, covered himself with his cloak and let no one enter. What did he do under that cloak? No one knows. But the next day he emerged and asked everyone to gather at the Law Rock. What he said next was a masterpiece of pragmatism. He reminded all gathered that Iceland was founded by people fleeing from one king's tyranny. Its strength lay in unity, in everyone obeying one law. If there were two sets of laws, two nations, Iceland would perish. There must be one law, he said, or peace will not be preserved. Then he announced his decision. Iceland would accept Christianity as the official religion. All Icelanders must be baptized. But, and this was key, pagans could continue worshipping the old gods privately, at home or in secret places. Public blots were forbidden, but private ones allowed. This was a compromise that allowed preserving unity without demanding pagans completely renounce their beliefs, and remarkably, both sides accepted it. There may have been protests, but no bloodshed. Iceland avoided civil war. Afterward, Thorgeir threw his pagan idols into a waterfall near his farm. The waterfall was named Godafoss, Waterfall of the Gods. It exists today, a witness to the moment when Iceland changed gods but preserved itself. After the peaceful conversion to Christianity in 1000 CE, Iceland entered what historians call its Golden Age. This was not a golden age of wealth or military power. Iceland remained a remote, poor island on the edge of the known world. This was a golden age of the mind and spirit. For over 2 centuries, Icelandic farmers and chieftains created one of the most remarkable literary traditions in medieval Europe. They wrote down the sagas, epic tales of heroes, outlaws, feuds, and adventures that would become treasures of world literature. But this was also an age of growing tension. The same freedom that allowed creativity to flourish also allowed powerful families to accumulate more and more power. The delicate balance that held Icelandic society together for 2 centuries began to crack. And by the end of this period, Iceland would face a choice: preserve its independence and risk tearing itself apart, or submit to a foreign king and lose what made it unique. Christianity changed Iceland in ways both obvious and subtle. Churches began appearing across the landscape. At first, simple wooden structures, later, more substantial stone buildings. In 1056, the first bishopric was established at Skalholt in the south. In 1106, a second followed at Hola in the north. These bishops became important figures not just in religious life but in politics and culture. But the Church's most profound gift to Iceland was literacy. Before Christianity, Icelanders knew runes, but runic writing was cumbersome and rarely used. The Church brought the Latin alphabet and, more importantly, the habit of writing. Initially, this was for religious purposes, copying the Bible, saints' lives, prayer books. Monasteries were founded where monks devoted themselves to this work. Yet something remarkable happened. Icelanders began using this new tool not just for Christian texts, but to preserve their own heritage. In the early 12th century, around 1120, a priest named Ari Thorgilsson wrote Islendingabok, the Book of Icelanders. This was the first prose history of Iceland, written in Icelandic rather than Latin. It told the story of the settlement, the establishment of the Althing, and the conversion to Christianity. Though brief, it set a precedent. Icelandic history was worth recording. Soon after came Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which detailed who settled where and when. This became a genealogical treasure, connecting every Icelandic family to the original settlers. Icelanders became obsessed with genealogy, knowing your ancestry, your connections, your place in the web of relationships that made up society. This wasn't mere vanity. In a society without formal government, knowing who was related to whom was crucial for understanding power dynamics. The Church also began accumulating wealth and power. Initially, local chieftains built churches on their lands and controlled them, but gradually the international church asserted more control. Bishops, educated abroad and connected to the broader Christian world, pushed for reforms. They wanted the church to control church property, not local chieftains. This created tensions that would simmer throughout the period. The real literary explosion came in the 13th century with the sagas. These were prose narratives, usually anonymous, that told stories of Iceland's past. Some sagas focused on the settlement period and the generations that followed. Others told of Icelandic adventures abroad, in Norway, Greenland, even North America. Still others recounted the lives of Norwegian kings or ancient Scandinavian heroes. The sagas were unlike anything else in medieval literature. They were written in a spare, realistic prose style that modern readers still find remarkably accessible. There was little moralizing, little supernatural intervention, unless essential to the plot. Characters were complex. Heroes had flaws, villains had virtues. The sagas showed human nature in all its messy complexity. Honour and vengeance, love and betrayal, courage and stupidity. Why did this literary flowering happen in Iceland of all places? Partly it was the unique Icelandic society. With no king and no rigid class system, a farmer's son could become a poet or historian. The culture valued words. Good speeches at the Althing could be as important as swords in battle. Partly it was practical. Long winters meant lots of time indoors, and partly it was the Icelandic character. A people who had left their homeland to start anew wanted to remember and preserve their story. These sagas were entertainment, certainly, but they were also history, legal precedents, and moral instruction. They were recited at winter gatherings when darkness covered the land for most of the day. Families would gather around the fire, and someone would recite from memory or read from a manuscript. This was how Icelanders passed the long winters, with stories. The sagas also served a political purpose. In an age when powerful families were competing for dominance, genealogy mattered. Being able to trace your descent to famous settlers gave you prestige and legitimacy. The sagas preserved these genealogies, but they also taught lessons about how power could corrupt, how feuds could destroy families, and how wisdom was often more valuable than strength. As the 12th century turned to the 13th, Icelandic society was changing in dangerous ways. The carefully balanced system of the commonwealth, with power distributed among many godar, with decisions made collectively at the Althing, was breaking down. A handful of powerful families were concentrating more and more power in their hands. The most powerful of these families were the Sturlungs, based in western Iceland. They were descended from Sturla Thordarson, a wealthy farmer and chieftain of the late 11th century. His descendants became the dominant force in Icelandic politics for much of the 13th century. They accumulated multiple godord, chieftaincies that gave them control over large numbers of followers. They built alliances through marriage. They used violence when necessary. But the Sturlungs were also remarkable writers. Several of the greatest sagas were written by family members. The most famous was Snorri Sturluson, born in 1179. Snorri was a political leader, controlling multiple chieftaincies and serving 3 times as law speaker, the highest honour in Iceland. But he was also Iceland's greatest medieval writer. Snorri wrote Heimskringla, a history of Norwegian kings that is still our main source for much of Norwegian history. He wrote the Prose Edda, which preserved countless Norse myths that would otherwise have been lost and taught the art of skaldic poetry. Without Snorri, much of what we know about Norse mythology would not exist. His work influenced not just Icelandic literature, but all of Scandinavian culture. But Snorri was also ambitious, ruthless, and ultimately doomed. He involved himself in Norwegian politics, trying to play different factions against each other for his own benefit. He made powerful enemies. In 1241, assassins sent by his former son-in-law broke into his house at Reykholt and killed him in his cellar. His last words, according to legend, were simply, "Don't strike." It was an ignominious end for Iceland's greatest writer, and it symbolised the violence that was consuming Icelandic society. The period from roughly 1220 to 1262 is called the Sturlungaöld, the age of the Sturlungs. It was the darkest period in Icelandic history before the modern era. The great families, the Sturlungs, the Oddaverjar, the Aspinningar, the Haukdelir, and others, fought constantly for supremacy. This wasn't the relatively restrained feuding of earlier times, where conflicts were resolved through law and compensation. This was war. Armies of hundreds of men clashed in pitched battles. Farms were burned. Churches were violated. Enemies were dragged from sanctuary and killed. The law, once Iceland's greatest achievement, became a tool for vengeance rather than justice. The Althing still met, but it had become a battlefield where different factions manoeuvred for advantage rather than working for the common good. One particularly notorious event occurred in 1238. At a place called Örlygsstaðir, over 1,000 men fought in what became the largest battle ever on Icelandic soil. The Sturlungs, despite being outnumbered, won a decisive victory. But victories meant little when the next battle was always coming. The cycle of violence seemed endless. The violence horrified ordinary Icelanders. Farmers caught between warring chieftains suffered terribly. Their livestock was stolen to feed armies. Their hay burned to deprive enemies of resources. Their sons forced to fight in feuds that weren't theirs. The commonwealth that their ancestors had built, the society that had lasted over 3 centuries, without a king, was destroying itself from within. Watching this chaos from across the sea was Hakon Hakonarson, king of Norway. Hakon was an ambitious and capable ruler who had consolidated his power in Norway. He looked at Iceland, culturally connected to Norway, sharing language and heritage, rich in resources like falcons and walrus ivory, and saw an opportunity. Hakon began cultivating relationships with Icelandic chieftains. He offered them titles, gifts, and promises of support against their rivals. Some Icelandic leaders, exhausted by the endless warfare, began to think that Norwegian rule might bring the peace and stability Iceland desperately needed. Others saw aligning with Norway as a way to gain advantage over their enemies. Still others resisted, wanting to preserve Icelandic independence at all costs. Haakon was patient. He didn't need to invade, he simply waited for Iceland to fall into his lap. He used a powerful tool, control of trade. Iceland depended on imports to grain, timber, iron. Most of this came through Norway. By controlling trade, Haakon could pressure Iceland without sending a single soldier. By 1262, the situation was unsustainable. Iceland was tearing itself apart. The leading chieftains, gathered at the Althing, made a fateful decision. They would swear allegiance to the Norwegian king. The terms seemed relatively generous. Icelanders would keep their laws and customs. The Althing would continue to function. They would pay taxes, but not exorbitant ones. In return, they would have peace and the king's protection. District by district, the Althing ratified the agreement. By 1264, all of Iceland had submitted to Norwegian rule. The Commonwealth, the remarkable experiment in government without kings, was over. It had lasted 332 years, longer than the United States has existed as an independent nation. Was this inevitable? Historians still debate this question. Some argue the Commonwealth's decentralized system couldn't survive as chieftains grew more powerful and concentrated authority. Others suggest that with better leadership and willingness to compromise, Iceland could have preserved its independence. We'll never know. What we do know is that after 1262, Iceland would be ruled by foreign powers for the next 678 years. But the saga age had given Iceland something that no king could take away: a literature, a cultural identity, and a memory of a time when they governed themselves. That memory would never die, and it would eventually inspire Icelanders to reclaim their freedom. The end of Iceland's independence in 1262 marked the beginning of nearly 7 centuries of foreign rule. First came the Norwegians, who had promised fair treatment and respect for Icelandic customs. Then, through royal marriage and political manoeuvring, came the Danes, who would rule Iceland for over 600 years. This period saw Iceland transformed from a land of independent farmers into a colonial possession, subjected to trade monopolies, natural disasters, and grinding poverty. Yet through it all, the Icelandic people endured, holding on to their language, their culture, and their identity. At first, Norwegian rule seemed tolerable. The Old Covenant of 1262-1264 guaranteed that Icelandic laws would remain in force and that the Althing would continue to function. Icelanders would pay taxes to the Norwegian king, but in return they would receive protection and peaceful governance. For a society exhausted by decades of civil war, this seemed like a fair bargain. But the reality soon proved different. The Norwegian king began appointing royal officials to Iceland: tax collectors, sheriffs, and eventually a governor. These men were often Norwegians with no connection to Iceland, interested primarily in extracting as much wealth as possible. The Althing still met, but it had lost its teeth. Real power now lay with the king's representatives. The legal system changed too. In 1271, King Magnus Hakonason introduced a new law code called Jonsbok, named after the Icelandic lawman Jon Einarsson, who helped compile it. While based on Norwegian law, it incorporated many Icelandic traditions. Jonsbok would remain Iceland's law code for over 500 years, a remarkable continuity. But it also represented a loss. Icelanders no longer made their own laws. Trade became more restricted. The Norwegian crown claimed monopoly rights over Icelandic trade, meaning Icelanders could only trade with merchants licensed by the king. This began the pattern that would plague Iceland for centuries. Foreign merchants controlled prices, both for what they sold to Iceland and what they bought from it. Icelanders had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. Still, life went on. Farmers raised their sheep, fished the rich waters, and survived the harsh climate as they always had. The church continued to grow in power and wealth. Monasteries became centres of learning where manuscripts were copied and preserved. The tradition of saga writing continued, though the greatest works had already been written. In 1402, disaster arrived on Icelandic shores. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that had devastated Europe 50 years earlier, finally reached Iceland. It came on a ship from England and spread rapidly through the close-knit communities. The plague killed between a third and half of Iceland's population. Entire farms were abandoned, their inhabitants dead. Churches stood empty. The plague was particularly deadly in the more densely populated areas of southern Iceland. Some remote farms in the north and east survived unscathed simply because they were so isolated that the disease never reached them. The Black Death had lasting effects beyond the immediate death toll. With so many dead, farmland went uncultivated. The population had dropped so low that it would take centuries to recover. The church, which had been growing wealthy and powerful, lost many of its clergy. Some monasteries closed permanently. The plague also disrupted trade. For several years, foreign merchants avoided Iceland, fearing contamination. When trade resumed, Iceland's bargaining position was even weaker. With a smaller population producing less, Iceland had less to trade and was more dependent on imports than ever. English traders, a century of conflict. In the 15th century, a new player entered the picture. English fishermen and traders. English merchants, particularly from Bristol and other west coast ports, discovered that the waters around Iceland were extraordinarily rich in cod. They began fishing Icelandic waters and trading with Icelandic farmers, often ignoring the Norwegian king's monopoly claims. Initially, many Icelanders welcomed the English. They paid better prices than Norwegian merchants and brought goods Iceland desperately needed. But tensions arose. Some English crews were violent, attacking Icelandic farms and clashing with Danish officials. Denmark had by now acquired Norway and Iceland through dynastic union. This conflict escalated into what historians call the English century in Iceland. Roughly 1400, 1500, there were multiple incidents of violence. English and Hanseatic German merchants fought each other in Icelandic harbours. English crews attacked the Danish governor's residence. Pirates raided coastal farms. The most notorious event occurred in 1467-1468. A dispute over trade led to armed conflict at Rif in western Iceland. The English seized the Danish governor, threw him in prison, and executed several of his men. The governor, Björn Thorleifsson, died under mysterious circumstances, poisoned, some said. Another governor was killed by an English axe to the head in 1495. Despite the violence, or perhaps because of it, this was actually a relatively prosperous period for some Icelanders. Trade was more open, prices more competitive. Farmers could play English and German merchants against each other, getting better deals than under a strict monopoly. But the instability was disturbing, and Iceland remained caught between competing foreign powers with no control over its own fate. In 1536, Denmark officially became Lutheran following the Protestant Reformation. King Christian III decided that Iceland must follow suit. This was not primarily about theology, it was about power and wealth. The Catholic Church in Iceland owned vast estates and had accumulated significant wealth. By converting to Lutheranism, the king could seize church property and assert greater control, but Icelanders, especially the bishops, resisted. The Catholic Church had been part of Icelandic society for over 500 years. The bishops were powerful figures, and many Icelanders were suspicious of this foreign-imposed religious change. The last Catholic bishop of Iceland, John Arason of Hólar, was particularly defiant. A poet, politician, and father of many children, clerical celibacy had never been strictly enforced in Iceland. John refused to accept the Reformation. In 1548, he and his sons raised an army and marched south to resist Lutheran authorities. Initially successful, they captured the Lutheran bishop and controlled much of southern Iceland. But John's luck ran out in 1550. He was captured through trickery, and without trial he and two of his sons were beheaded at Skalholt on November 7, 1550. His execution shocked Iceland. Beheading a bishop was unprecedented, but it marked the end of Catholic resistance. Iceland became officially Lutheran a status it maintains to this day. The Reformation transformed Icelandic society. Monastery lands were seized by the crown. The two ancient bishoprics remained at Skalholt and Hola, but bishops now serve the king rather than the pope. Church services switched from Latin to Icelandic, which had the positive effect of promoting literacy. Every Icelander was expected to learn to read the Bible. If Icelanders had hoped that the Reformation might bring positive change, they were quickly disappointed. In 1602, the Danish king established a strict trade monopoly. All trade with Iceland had to go through Copenhagen, and only Danish merchants licensed by the crown could trade with Iceland. These merchants were granted specific districts. Each had a monopoly in their assigned area, meaning Icelandic farmers had no choice but to deal with that one merchant. This system was devastating for Iceland's economy. Danish merchants could set whatever prices they wanted. They paid low prices for Icelandic goods: fish, wool, sheepskins, and falcons, prized for hunting. They charged high prices for imports: grain, timber, iron, and luxury goods. There was no competition, no free market, no way for Icelanders to get a fair deal. The monopoly lasted, with some modifications, until 1787, nearly 200 years. During this period, Iceland grew progressively poorer. Living standards declined. Farms that had sustained families for generations were abandoned. The population, which had been perhaps 70,000 before the Black Death, had dropped to around 50,000 by 1700 and would fall even further. Yet Icelanders survived. They maintained their language when many small European peoples were losing theirs. They preserved their literary heritage, copying and recopying the old sagas. They developed a remarkable oral culture, with poetry, storytelling, and learning valued even in the poorest households. They endured because endurance was all they could do. By 1550, Iceland had been under foreign rule for nearly 300 years. The next 3 centuries would bring even greater challenges: pirates, volcanic eruptions, famine, and smallpox. But they would also eventually bring something Icelanders had not known for over 600 years: the first stirrings of independence. If the period of Norwegian and early Danish rule was difficult, what came next was catastrophic. The 17th and 18th centuries are sometimes called Iceland's Dark Ages, and with good reason. A series of disasters, both natural and man-made, reduced Iceland to perhaps the lowest point in its history. Pirates enslaved Icelanders. Volcanoes erupted, poisoning livestock and causing famine. Smallpox swept through communities. The population dropped to barely 40,000. Iceland seemed to be dying. Yet somehow, even in these darkest times, something remarkable happened. Icelanders didn't just survive. They began to rediscover their past. Scholars started collecting and studying the old manuscripts. A sense of national identity began to emerge, separate from Denmark. By the end of this period, the seeds of independence had been planted, though they wouldn't flower for another century. In July 1627, something happened that no Icelander could have imagined. North African pirates attacked Iceland. These were not Vikings or European raiders. These were Barbary corsairs from Algiers, operating thousands of kilometers from their home waters. The pirates arrived in 3 ships. They raided the Westman Islands off the south coast, killing dozens and capturing about 240 people. They moved to the Reykjanes Peninsula in the southwest, raiding settlements there. Then they sailed to the East Fjords, where they raided for 3 more days. In total, they captured between 400 and 800 Icelanders to sell as slaves in North Africa. The captives endured a nightmare voyage to Algiers, where they were sold in slave markets. Most were used as labourers or household servants. Some Icelandic women ended up in harems. A few converted to Islam to improve their conditions. The most famous captive was Gudrida Simonardóttir, who was bought by a Turkish official and lived in his household. The Danish king eventually ransomed some of the captives. In 1636, after 9 years in captivity, Gudrida and a few dozen others returned to Iceland. but many never came back. They died in captivity, disappeared into the Islamic world, or chose not to return. For Iceland, this was traumatic. These remote islands, which had always seemed safe from such horrors, proved vulnerable after all. The raids had lasting effects. Coastal farms were abandoned as people moved inland. Iceland's already weak defences were exposed, and Icelanders felt a deep sense of abandonment by Denmark, which had failed to protect them despite centuries of taxes paid to the Danish crown. As if pirates weren't enough, nature itself seemed to turn against Iceland. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the worst of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that brought exceptionally cold winters and short, cool summers. For Iceland, already on the edge of habitability, this was devastating. Ice expanded around the coasts, making fishing more difficult and dangerous. Sea ice sometimes surrounded the entire island, cutting it off from the outside world for months. Hay harvests failed in cold, wet summers. Without hay, farmers couldn't feed their livestock through winter. Without livestock, people starved. The winter of 1695 was particularly brutal. It was called the Frost Famine, or Frost Winter. Cold weather lasted through the summer, destroying crops. The next winter was even worse. Thousands died of starvation. Some historians estimate 20% of the population perished. Desperate farmers killed their breeding stock just to survive the winter, which meant they had nothing to rebuild their herds when conditions improved. These famines recurred throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Each time, Iceland's population dropped a bit more. Farms were abandoned. Bloodlines that had existed since the settlement period died out. Iceland, it seemed, might simply cease to exist. Sturlung, the smallpox epidemic. A population decimated. In 1707, smallpox reached Iceland. The disease had appeared before, but this outbreak was particularly deadly. It killed approximately 18,000 people, about a third of Iceland's total population at the time. The disease spread rapidly through the close-knit communities where families lived in confined spaces during winter. Smallpox returned in 1709, killing thousands more. Children were especially vulnerable. Entire families were wiped out. Some remote valleys lost most of their population. The disease didn't discriminate. It killed rich and poor, old and young. The demographic impact was staggering. Iceland's population, which had been around 50,000 in 1700, dropped to about 35,000 by 1710. It would take nearly a century to recover these losses. Combined with the earlier Black Death and ongoing famines, Iceland had lost perhaps two-thirds of its population since medieval times. If you asked historians to name the single worst disaster in Icelandic history, many would point to 1783. That year, a volcanic fissure called Laki began erupting in one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in recorded history. The eruption began in June 1783 and continued for 8 months. It produced the largest lava flow in recorded history, over 14 cubic kilometres of lava covering more than 500 square kilometres. But the lava itself wasn't the main problem. The eruption released massive amounts of poisonous gases, sulfur dioxide, hydrofluoric acid and hydrochloric acid. These gases created a toxic fog that covered Iceland. Livestock that ate grass covered in volcanic ash and fluoride began dying in huge numbers. First their teeth fell out, then their bones weakened. Then they died. Sheep, cattle, horses, the animals that Icelanders depended on for survival, perished by the thousands. The human toll followed. With their livestock dead, Icelanders faced famine. People ate seaweed, boiled hides, anything they could find. Many simply starved. By the time it was over, approximately 10,000 Icelanders had died, more than 20% of the population. Some parishes lost over half their people. The Laki eruption had global effects too. The volcanic gases and ash affected weather across the northern hemisphere, causing crop failures in Europe and strange weather in North America. But nowhere suffered like Iceland. The Danish government seriously considered evacuating the entire population and abandoning Iceland permanently. Only the impracticality of relocating 40,000 people prevented it. Iceland survived Laki, but barely. The population dropped to about 40,000, the lowest point since the Black Death. It seemed impossible that things could get worse, and yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Even in these dark times, light was emerging. The 18th century saw the Enlightenment spread across Europe, with its emphasis on reason, education and progress. These ideas reached even remote Iceland. In 1746, a remarkable institution was founded, Hið Íslenska Lærdomslistafélag, the Icelandic Literary Society. Its members, mostly educated Icelanders in Copenhagen, began collecting and studying Iceland's medieval manuscripts. They realized that these old sagas and histories, which some dismissed as mere stories, were actually treasures, unique records of medieval Scandinavian culture. Scholars like Arni Magnusson devoted their lives to collecting manuscripts. Arni travelled throughout Iceland in the early 18th century, gathering old vellum books from farms and churches. He saved countless manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. When he died in 1730, his collection became the foundation of what's now the Arni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik, one of Iceland's most important cultural institutions. This scholarly work had profound effects. It reminded Icelanders that they had a glorious past, that they weren't just poor farmers on a remote island, but descendants of the people who created the sagas, who founded the Althing, who explored Greenland and North America. Pride in this heritage began to grow. In 1752, Iceland got its first printing press, established at Hólar in the north. Books began to be printed in Icelandic, Bibles, religious texts, but also secular works. Literacy, already high because of the Lutheran emphasis on reading scripture, increased further. Iceland developed an intellectual culture disproportionate to its small, poor population. In 1787, Denmark finally abolished the trade monopoly that had strangled Iceland's economy for 185 years. Now any Danish merchant could trade with Iceland, and eventually foreign merchants were allowed too. This wasn't generous altruism. Denmark realised the monopoly wasn't even profitable anymore, and pressure was mounting from Enlightenment-minded reformers who opposed such restrictions. The effects were immediate and positive. Prices became more competitive. Icelanders could sell their goods for better prices and buy imports more cheaply. The economy, which had been moribund for centuries, showed signs of life. New fishing stations were established. Trade increased. More importantly, the end of the monopoly was symbolic. For the first time in living memory, Denmark had loosened its grip on Iceland, however slightly. This suggested that further reforms might be possible. Among educated Icelanders, especially those studying in Copenhagen, ideas began circulating. If Denmark could reform the trade system, perhaps it could reform political arrangements too. Perhaps Iceland could regain some measure of self-government. These were just whispers in the 1790s, radical thoughts that most people dismissed as impossible. But they were the seeds of something that would grow in the next century: nationalism, independence movements, and eventually the restoration of Icelandic sovereignty. By 1800, Iceland had survived the worst. The population began slowly growing again. The economy gradually improved, and most importantly, Icelanders began to believe that they had a future, not just as poor Danish subjects, but as a nation with its own identity and destiny. The 19th century began with Iceland as one of the poorest, most isolated places in Europe. It ended with Iceland on the verge of independence. This transformation didn't happen through revolution or war. Iceland's path to freedom was achieved through persistent negotiation, cultural revival, and the determination of a small but remarkable group of nationalist leaders. By 1944, after more than 680 years under foreign rule, Iceland would finally become a fully sovereign nation. But the road was long, and victory was never guaranteed. Every independence movement needs its heroes, and Iceland found its greatest champion in Jón Sigurðsson. Born in 1811 to a poor rural minister, Jon went to Copenhagen to study in 1833 and never returned to live in Iceland. Yet from Denmark he would become the architect of Icelandic independence. Jon was a scholar first. He studied Icelandic history and literature, edited medieval manuscripts, and became one of Europe's leading experts on Old Norse texts. But he was also a politician and a visionary. He understood something crucial. Iceland couldn't win independence through military force. It had no army, no weapons, barely 50,000 people. Instead, independence would have to be won through legal arguments, diplomatic pressure, and appeals to justice. In 1841, Jon began publishing a journal called Ny Felagsrit, New Social Journal, which advocated for Icelandic rights. He argued that Iceland had never truly been conquered by Denmark. It had voluntarily accepted Norwegian rule in 1262, and when Norway and Denmark united, Iceland's allegiance was to a personal union of crowns, not to Denmark itself. Therefore, Iceland had the right to self-government. These arguments might seem like legal hair-splitting, but in 19th century Europe, where legitimacy and historical precedent mattered, they were powerful. Jon became the voice of Iceland, respected even by Danish officials who opposed his goals. His birthday, June 17th, would eventually become Iceland's national day. Jon's first major victory came in 1843. The Danish king, responding to growing nationalist sentiment across his realm and influenced by liberal ideas spreading through Europe, agreed to convene consultative assemblies for Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. For Iceland, this meant the Althing would meet again. The Althing hadn't functioned as a real legislative body since medieval times. Under Norwegian and Danish rule, it had become just a court. But in 1845, the Althing reconvened at Reykjavik, moved from ancient Thingvellir as a consultative assembly. It had no real power. It could only advise the Danish crown, but symbolically, this was enormous. The institution that had been the heart of independent Iceland was alive again. Jon Sigurdsson was elected to the Althing and quickly became its dominant figure, though he attended from Copenhagen. He used the Althing as a platform to push for greater autonomy. Every session saw demands for more control over Icelandic affairs, control of finances, control of trade, control of administration. The Danes resisted, but Jon was patient and persistent. While political change moved slowly, Iceland's economy and society were transforming. The 19th century saw Iceland's population finally begin growing consistently, reaching about 78,000 by 1900. Fishing became increasingly important, supplementing traditional sheep farming. New fishing stations were established around the coast. Technology began reaching Iceland. Steamships replaced sailing vessels, making transportation more reliable. Telegraph cables connected Iceland to Europe in 1906. Roads, though still poor, improved slightly. Reykjavik grew from a tiny village of a few hundred to a town of several thousand, becoming Iceland's undisputed capital and commercial centre. Education expanded. More schools were established. Literacy, already high, became nearly universal. Newspapers proliferated. Iceland developed a vibrant press culture, with multiple papers representing different political views. For such a small population, the intellectual and cultural life was remarkably rich. Women began demanding rights too. In 1882, Iceland had only 377 unmarried women aged 20-50, versus 2,191 unmarried men. A severe gender imbalance caused by limited economic opportunities that force women to marry for survival. Bríet Bjarnhédinsdóttir founded Iceland's first women's magazine in 1887, advocating for women's education and rights. Icelandic women gained the right to vote in municipal elections in 1908 and national elections in 1915, relatively early by European standards. In 1874, Iceland celebrated the 1000th anniversary of settlement. Danish King Christian IX visited, the first reigning monarch ever to set foot in Iceland. As a gift, he granted Iceland a constitution. It wasn't independence, but it was progress. Iceland now had control over its internal affairs, though foreign policy and defence remained with Denmark. The Althing became a true legislature, though with limited powers. But Icelanders wanted more. The situation was frustrating. Iceland controlled some affairs, but not others. Danish officials still held key positions. Most importantly, Iceland still sent its taxes to Copenhagen. Nationalists argued that Iceland should control its own finances and have a minister responsible to the Althing, not to Denmark. The breakthrough came in 1904. After decades of negotiation, Denmark granted Iceland home rule. Iceland would have its own minister, residing in Reykjavik, who would handle Icelandic affairs. The first minister was Hannes Hafstein, a poet and politician who proved that Iceland could govern itself competently. Home rule wasn't independence, but it was close. Iceland now controlled almost all its domestic affairs. Only foreign policy and defence remained with Denmark. Jon Sigurdsson didn't live to see this. Triumph, he died in 1879, but his work had made it possible. Icelanders mourned him as a national father, and his image would later appear on Icelandic currency. In the early 20th century, Icelandic nationalism intensified. Young firebrands demanded full independence, not just home rule. They were inspired by other small nations gaining independence. Norway broke from Sweden in 1905, Finland from Russia in 1917, Ireland from Britain in 1922. If they could do it, why not Iceland? World War I created opportunities. Denmark remained neutral, but the war disrupted trade and communications, forcing Iceland to act more independently. Iceland established its own flag in 1915, blue with a red Nordic cross outlined in white. It was a powerful symbol. Iceland had its own identity, separate from Denmark. In 1918, after years of negotiation, Iceland and Denmark signed the Act of Union. Iceland became a sovereign state in personal union with Denmark. They shared a monarch. The Danish king was also King of Iceland. But Iceland was otherwise independent. Iceland controlled its own foreign affairs and could conduct its own foreign policy. The act would be reviewed after 25 years, and either side could terminate it. This was sovereignty, but not quite full independence. Iceland was its own country, but still tied to Denmark through the crown. Most Icelanders accepted this as a stepping stone. Full independence could wait. World War II changed everything. In April 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark. Britain, fearing Germany would use Iceland as a base, immediately occupied Iceland, despite Icelandic protests and official neutrality. In 1941, British forces were replaced by Americans, who built major military bases. The occupation was transformative. Thousands of foreign troops brought money into the economy. Iceland experienced an economic boom. Infrastructure improved dramatically. Roads, harbours, airfields. Icelanders worked construction jobs and service positions, earning unprecedented incomes. Reykjavik transformed from a sleepy town to a busy city. But the occupation also proved Iceland could function independently. With Denmark under Nazi occupation, all ties were severed. Iceland ran its own affairs completely, conducted its own diplomacy, made its own decisions. It proved to itself and the world that it was a real nation. In 1944, with Denmark still occupied, Iceland held a referendum. Should it dissolve the union with Denmark and become a republic? The vote was overwhelming. 97% voted yes. On June 17, 1944, Jon Sigurdsson's birthday, Iceland declared itself a fully independent republic at Thingvellir, the site of the ancient Althing. Denmark, still under occupation, couldn't do much but accept. After the war, Denmark officially recognised Icelandic independence. There was some bitterness. Some Danes felt Iceland had taken advantage of Denmark's weakness. But Iceland had followed legal procedures, held a referendum and acted within its rights under the 1918 Act of Union. Iceland's path to independence was remarkably peaceful. No war of liberation, no violent revolution, no blood spilled for freedom. This was achieved through patience, legal arguments, and diplomatic persistence. It took 144 years from Jón Sigurdsson's birth to full independence, but it happened. On June 17, 1944, as Icelanders gathered at Thingvellir to proclaim their republic, they could reflect on an extraordinary journey. From a nation that had nearly died in the 18th century, that had suffered every imaginable disaster, that had been poor and powerless for centuries, Iceland had emerged as a sovereign nation. The commonwealth that ended in 1262 was reborn in 1944, and this time Iceland would never surrender its freedom again. In 1944, Iceland was still one of Europe's poorest countries. Most people lived on farms or in tiny fishing villages. There was one paved street in the entire country. The economy depended almost entirely on fish. The population was barely 130,000. Yet within 2 generations, Iceland would transform itself into one of the world's wealthiest nations, with living standards rivaling Norway and Switzerland. Then, in 2008, it would experience the most catastrophic banking collapse in history relative to the size of its economy. This is the story of modern Iceland: ambition, success, hubris, and resilience. When independence came in 1944, American forces were still in Iceland, operating military bases built during the war. The Americans would remain in various forms until 2006. This presence was controversial. Many Icelanders resented foreign troops on their soil. But it was also economically transformative. The bases employed thousands of Icelanders at good wages. American money flowed into the economy. The infrastructure built for military purposes, roads, harbours, the airport at Keflavik, served civilian needs too. Icelanders learned English, absorbed American culture, and developed connections to the wider world. In 1949, Iceland made a fateful decision. It joined NATO, the Western military alliance. For a country with no army of its own, Iceland has never had a military, this was protection against the Soviet Union, whose submarines prowled the North Atlantic, but it also tied Iceland firmly to the West in the Cold War. The decision sparked protests. Iceland's left-wing parties saw it as betraying neutrality, but the majority accepted it as necessary. The first decades of independence focused on building a modern state. Iceland needed everything: schools, hospitals, roads, telecommunications, harbours. The government invested heavily in infrastructure. Reykjavik grew rapidly, transforming from a town of 30,000 in 1940 to over 80,000 by 1970. For the first time in history, most Icelanders lived in urban areas rather than farms. Education expanded dramatically. The University of Iceland, founded in 1911, grew into a major institution. Literacy was already universal, but now Iceland developed one of the world's best educated populations. By the 21st century, Iceland would have the highest proportion of university graduates among OECD countries. Iceland's wealth has always depended on fish, particularly cod. The waters around Iceland are among the world's richest fishing grounds, but these same waters also attracted foreign trawlers, especially British ones, that had fished there for centuries. After independence, Iceland began extending its territorial waters to protect fish stocks and give Icelandic fishermen exclusive access. In 1952, Iceland extended its waters to 4 nautical miles, in 1958 to 12 miles, in 1972 to 50 miles, in 1975 to 200 miles. Each extension provoked conflict with Britain, whose fishing industry depended heavily on Icelandic waters. These conflicts became known as the Cod Wars, though they were more like very aggressive policing actions than actual wars. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels confronted British trawlers, cutting their fishing nets with specially designed trawl wire cutters. British Royal Navy warships escorted their trawlers. Ships rammed each other. Warning shots were fired. It was dangerous and tense. But Iceland had advantages. It threatened to withdraw from NATO and close the Keflavik base, which would be a strategic disaster for NATO in the Cold War. Britain needed Iceland's cooperation more than Iceland needed British fishing access. Each time, Iceland won. The final Cod War in 1975-1976 ended with Britain accepting Iceland's 200-mile limit. These victories were enormously important. They secured Iceland's most valuable resource. The 200-mile exclusive economic zone became standard internationally. Iceland's audacious claims helped establish modern maritime law. And for Icelanders, standing up to the mighty British Navy and winning reinforced national pride and confidence. In the 1950s and 1960s, Iceland remained relatively poor by European standards. But from the 1970s onward, the economy took off. Fish exports, now protected by the expanded territorial waters, generated substantial revenue. Iceland developed a sophisticated fishing industry, with modern vessels and processing facilities, but Iceland also diversified. Cheap geothermal and hydroelectric power attracted energy-intensive industries. Aluminum smelters were built. Processing imported alumina for export. Tourism began growing, attracted by Iceland's dramatic landscapes and unique culture. By the 1990s, Iceland's standard of living matched the rest of Scandinavia. The key to Iceland's success was education and innovation. Icelanders invested heavily in technology, research and skills. They built a knowledge economy despite having only 300,000 people. Iceland pioneered genetic research, leveraging its unique population with excellent genealogical records. Icelandic tech companies emerged. The economy became modern and sophisticated. Icelanders enjoyed one of the world's highest standards of living: universal healthcare, excellent education, generous social services, virtually no poverty. Reykjavik became a vibrant cultural capital with thriving music, art, and literary scenes. Iceland regularly topped quality of life rankings. For a country that had been desperately poor just decades earlier, it was an astonishing transformation. In the early 2000s, Iceland deregulated its banking sector. 3 banks, Althing, Landsbanki and Glitnir, expanded aggressively internationally. They borrowed heavily abroad and invested in everything from British retail chains to foreign real estate. By 2008, Iceland's banking system had assets worth 10 times the country's entire GDP. This seemed like prosperity at first. Icelanders felt wealthy. They borrowed cheaply to buy houses, cars and luxury goods. Many invested in foreign property. Iceland's currency, the krona, was strong. The economy boomed. Reykjavik became an expensive city where top chefs opened restaurants and designer boutiques lined shopping streets. But it was built on a foundation of sand. The banks were hugely over-leveraged, borrowing short-term money to make long-term investments, a classic recipe for disaster. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, international credit markets froze. The Icelandic banks couldn't roll over their debts. In October 2008, all 3 major banks collapsed within a single week. The impact was catastrophic. The banking system's liabilities were many times larger than the entire Icelandic economy. The government couldn't possibly bail out the banks. The krona collapsed, losing half its value. Inflation soared. Unemployment, virtually unknown in Iceland, suddenly appeared. Many Icelanders who had borrowed in foreign currencies found their debts doubled overnight. Icelanders lost savings, jobs, and confidence. Many young people emigrated. The country that had seemed so prosperous revealed itself to have been living on borrowed money and borrowed time. The crash was proportionally the largest banking collapse any country had experienced relative to its economy size. But Iceland proved resilient. Rather than bailing out the banks at taxpayers' expense like many countries did, Iceland let them fail. The government protected domestic deposits, but let international creditors take losses. This was controversial and led to conflicts with Britain and the Netherlands. but it protected ordinary Icelanders from bearing the full cost. Iceland imposed capital controls to stabilise the currency. It negotiated an IMF bailout programme. The economy contracted sharply, GDP fell over 10%, but then began recovering. By 2012, growth had resumed. By 2015, Iceland was booming again, now driven by a massive surge in tourism rather than banking. The krona strengthened. Unemployment fell. Living standards recovered. The crisis taught harsh lessons. Iceland learned that a tiny nation cannot sustain a massive international banking system. It learned the dangers of overconfidence and overleveraging. It learned that prosperity must be built on real productive activity. Fish, aluminum, tourism, not financial speculation. The political system changed too. The 2008 crash discredited the establishment. New parties emerged. The centre-left came to power. There were calls for Iceland to join the European Union, though these faded as recovery took hold. The old certainties were questioned. Iceland entered the 2010s chastened but wiser. By 2010, Iceland had travelled an extraordinary journey. From a country that shouldn't exist, too remote, too cold, too volcanic, it had become a prosperous modern nation. From the Viking settlement to the Commonwealth, through foreign rule and dark ages, to independence and prosperity, Iceland had survived everything history threw at it. What explains Iceland's success? Partly it's the people. Icelanders are educated, hard-working and innovative. Partly it's resources, fish, geothermal power, dramatic scenery that attracts tourists. Partly it's culture. Iceland maintained its language and identity through centuries of foreign rule, giving it cohesion and purpose. But perhaps most importantly, Iceland never gave up. When pirates came, when volcanoes erupted, when diseases killed thousands, when foreign powers exploited them, Icelanders endured. They survived because survival was all they could do. And eventually, survival became success. Today, Iceland is a small country with a big voice, punching far above its weight in international affairs, culture and innovation. The island born of fire and ice, settled by Vikings fleeing tyranny, nearly destroyed by disasters, has not just survived but thrived. And the story continues, as it has for over 1,000 years, at the edge of the Arctic, where the impossible becomes possible.